Hey class, welcome to Chapter 9, Module 9, in which we explore the family distress model and the contextual model of family stress. Now we're delving deeper into family stress and crisis models, and these are the last two models that we are going to explore together. So now we've gone from the 1950s all the way down to the current day. These are kind of the two of the latest models that explore family stress and crisis. After this, we're then going to move into strategies for intervention. So in Module 10, we will look at kind of the organization or how the history and philosophy of formal crisis management. And then in Chapter 11, Module 11, we will move into our final module, which is a little bit more extensive because it has a lot of thoughts about how to intervene. You will find that the interventions in Module 11 are a lot of what we do in social work already, and a lot of what you've learned that applied to formal crisis management. However, before we get there, we have to go through two last models. So when you're ready, let's begin with an introduction to the family distress model. Next slide, please. So the family distress model is here illustrated on the left. I derived this from the text itself. It's essentially a guide to understanding the processes that families go through to confront and accommodate change. Now remember, crisis, when well managed, can help a family change. In fact, as you remember, the strategic family therapists envision crisis as being a necessary precipitant to change. If we stay the same, if nothing unbalances us and shifts us off center, then we just keep doing what we've always done. But when something happens to shift us from our current homeostasis, we then have to begin to reevaluate where we're at and are we functioning well. Same is true of families. So this particular model, the family distress model, was highly influenced by family systems theory. There's essentially 5 phases that can be used to help guide interventions with families. Those 5 phases are the family's stable pattern, their predictable pattern, the way they normally are. Then the introduction of a problem. The family then experiences crisis and it comes unbalanced. Then they have to organize themselves differently around the crisis. And then another consideration or another phase of this model is social supports to cope. So let's begin exploring this model a little bit more in depth. Next slide, please. So you notice I've circled at the top the family's stable pattern, the predictable pattern. Look, families have normal ways of coping, normal ways of interacting with the world, of being a family, right? And those fit their resources, they fit their family identity, who are we, they fit their values, and they fit their goals. So families kind of operate in a certain way, believing their pattern is normal, and it's what's preferred. It's the way they've always been. It's how they've organized themselves over the years that they've been a family. Now these patterns can include things like their routines. What happens when parents come home from work or when they go to work? How you get the kids ready for school, how do you handle medical visits with the kids, those kinds of things, right? When do you go to church on Sunday, if you go to church, or how do you celebrate birthdays? The roles, who does what in the family, the rituals, the way the family does certain things, for example, birthdays or family discipline. And finally, the rules of the family. Now remember, those rules can be either spoken or unspoken. Spoken rules are things that have been said, and preferably in a family, written down, posted somewhere like the refrigerator. But there's also unspoken rules. For example, I had a family that I was doing family therapy with. The father was a cop, and he had had a heart attack at one point. And whenever we encountered very difficult stuff in the family, he would grab his heart and lean over like this. Now, the first few times, I didn't notice that. But the family would like stop talking about what they were talking about, and there would be a lull in the conversation. And I couldn't figure out what happened. And finally, I noticed the father doing this, and I said, are you about to have a heart attack? He goes, no. I said, well, when you grab your heart and lean forward, everybody stops talking. It was really interesting. So there was an unspoken rule in this family: don't talk about difficult topics or dad will have a heart attack, right? And we were able to get past that in the crisis that they were having to move them on. Families make decisions on a routine basis that support their identity, that support their values, and they base their goals upon those patterns. So they have these predictable ways of being in the world, or of being as a family, or of doing things, right? And that predictable way, that normal pattern, then encounters a crisis, which moves us to our next slide. So here you see we've got this disrupting event. See where that little circle is on the left there? This is like the stressor in other models. Something happens to interrupt or disrupt the family's normal, predictable pattern. Now, this disrupting event can come from internal factors. The wife could be tired of the way her husband responds to her. The husband could be angry at the wife for trying to control things, or the kids could be acting out for some reason, right? And so, or somebody could experience sickness, or there could be a death in the family. Any number of things can disrupt normal function, but they can also come from outside. So somebody shooting into the window of the house, or somebody stealing a car of the family, right? These would be outside things or external events that disrupt the family's normal functioning. So next slide, please. So the second phase of the family distress model is the problem. Now, we've already talked about how this disruptive event intervened itself into the family's normal way of functioning, their normal patterns of functioning, right? So their normal patterns are then disrupted. The family experiences stress, and then they resolve this stress, or try to resolve the stress, using pre-existing patterns, normal ways of functioning. They try to use what's always worked in the past to function and to deal with this distressing, troubling event. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this by looking more in depth at the two items that are circled here in the next slide. So the family patterns are disrupted, family experiences distress, and the problem disrupts the family's traditional or predictable patterns of routines, of roles, rituals, and rules, right? And that leads the system, the family system, to becoming vulnerable, which is what the typology model taught us. So let's move on to the next slide then to see a little bit more about how these problems impact the family. Most problems are minor inconveniences. They're addressed without much thought. There's not much conscious attention. The kid gets a lower grade, than usual, and the family responds to it. Or the father has a challenge at work, and the family knows how to respond to it. Or there's an argument between the mother and daughter, and the family knows how to deal with that, right? So they don't really give it much thought and conscious attention. They use already existing strategies that are fairly simple. Now, if this works, then they go back to phase one, their normal predictable patterns. If it doesn't work, then they have to try some different strategies to deal with the problem. They have to kind of flex the way they've always done things to adjust to this disrupting event. Now, if those don't work, and the problem continues or gets worse, then they're going to move into phase three, which is the crisis. So let's now turn to phase three, the family experiences crisis. So in the family distress model, a crisis is a problem for which the family believes no solution is available. Now, there is a solution. Other families have dealt with this in the past, but this family has never dealt with it, and so they don't see a way of addressing this crisis. Now, because they don't believe a solution is available, they have to do a couple of things to respond. They can withdraw from their social supports, or they can seek social supports. So let's delve a little bit more into what we mean by this. We'll move then to the next slide. So the family then has these patterns that are emerging, that are kind of developing around the crisis. They organize patterns around their crisis. They may withdraw from potential social supports. They can become preoccupied and overly focused, crisis-oriented, right? Focused on the crisis. And thus, the crisis can become necessary for stability and predictability. In other words, this family becomes so organized around the crisis that if the crisis were to go away, the family would once again be disrupted. This is a very dysfunctional way of dealing with crisis. This is when families become crisis-oriented. They need crises in their life, maybe for a sense of adventure, maybe because the parents aren't getting along and need a crisis to help them stay organized. Often one of the children will act out to kind of focus the family on them, so that the family can kind of function well. And so this becomes the problem child, and they're constantly in some kind of crisis around this child. For whatever reason, a family then organizes itself in a way that is crisis-oriented, crisis-focused, problem-focused. And somehow they need crisis in their life to survive, because that's their normal pattern. However, other families do things slightly differently. We'll get to that in a minute, but let's look at each of these elements, these 4 things that are circled here, in a little bit more detail. So, some families believe they need to resolve the crisis without assistance. They see themselves as independent, as fiercely rugged, or they're a family kind of based in shame, and they don't want other people to know their business, and so they don't want people inside their family looking at how things are going, and so they kind of hide their crisis to a degree. They can withdraw from social supports, things like sources of aid or association, like stop going to church or stop going to clubs, or even affection. They can kind of, like, if they had relationships where there was some affection and there was a crisis, now they've removed themselves from a potential source of love and concern. So the family becomes preoccupied with the crisis. Next slide, please. So the family then tries to resolve this crisis without assistance by withdrawing, and the crisis begins to overshadow the family's sense of well-being and wholeness and health. The members' needs, the need for love and affection and knowing that they matter, those kinds of needs become secondary to the crisis. This crisis then becomes central to the family functioning. They're completely organized around the crisis, the trauma, right? Next slide, we'll move to the next circle. So some families may modify their patterns of family routines, rules, and roles into new patterns that are organized around the crisis. They may experience some temporary relief as they focus on the crisis, but the long-term problem is that this crisis continues to bring about distress for the family, and it creates new problems and stressors as the family needs are neglected. So consider the case of an alcoholic father. So the family kind of organizes themselves around his alcoholism. They think when he's been drinking, they wonder if he's going to act out, they wonder if he's going to be aggressive or violent, and so they kind of are all organized around the father's drinking. And this kind of withdrawal from each other and withdrawal from the alcoholic member of the family then means that families' needs are being neglected, because the mother's constantly worried about the dad, yelling at the kids or yelling at her, and so she's kind of withdrawn and on her guard, and the kids are all kind of in their separate spaces, avoiding the father, and so they become organized around this problem. However, what if the father sobers up? Well, now they've been so organized around the problem that they may see the father's going to AA every day as the problem. The father or the child or the mother or whatever member of the family continues to be the focus, or the stressor crisis continues to be the focus of the family. And so they have trouble moving beyond that because they've been organized that way. Next slide, please. So the final piece of this is that they organize their patterns, their family patterns around the crisis. They, are now so organized around the crisis, as I had previously mentioned, that when the crisis is gone, now the family experiences distress because the crisis is gone, because they're organized around this crisis, right? So their routines, their roles, their rules, all these things designed to deal with the crisis no longer work. So the family then has to reestablish, now they're unbalanced, they have to reestablish equilibrium, homeostasis, by resisting solution to the crisis or by creating a new crisis, which then would return them to phase 3. So when families get organized around the crisis, then when the crisis is gone, they have no reason for being, no clear sense of functioning or clear sense of coherence, or they don't know what to do. Now, other families do quite the opposite. They rely on social supports to organize themselves around crisis. So let's move to that for a moment. Notice that the circle's changed to the left and is encompassing 3 separate constructs. So in crisis, families that don't organize around the crisis may seek potential social supports to help them deal with it. They may view this disruption in the context of their goals. Their goals may be a good marriage, or raising the children well, or helping the next generation move out of poverty, or, I don't know, building good moral kids, right? So they now have a disruption in those goals. And so they have to then resolve or somehow manage this disruption. This can lead to a new and, frankly, healthier pattern of stability. It can also lead to a deterioration in their stability as well. So let's look at each of these components one by one. Notice that the circle shrunk to the very first rectangle there. Families look outside their own world for help, these families in phase 5. They are aware that what they've done in the past has not worked. Their predictable patterns have not been effective to deal with this crisis. And frankly, some families may have recognized that being crisis-oriented, the right side of this diagram, phase 4, was not sufficient. And so now they're kind of looking in a new direction, right? This family's beginning to change. They're aware that the strategies haven't worked, and so they have to turn elsewhere for help, maybe to professionals like you for help. They may seek aid, which would be concrete goods and services like help paying the bills or childcare. They may seek affiliation, a place to belong. And so now they've joined some kind of support group or a church or a synagogue or a temple, or they're looking for a place to belong. They may seek affection, emotional support in a time of crisis. I mean, imagine if there's been a death in the family and everybody in the family is grieving, they may need to look outside of the family for some support. Or in a worst case scenario, back to the husband who's an alcoholic, the wife may not be getting her affection needs from him and may turn elsewhere and could potentially have an affair, right? So let's move to the next circle. So the family then, in this situation, receives some useful resources, maybe some ideas or some methods of coping with crisis from you, the social worker. They can then view this disruption or crisis in the context of their goals. So you have helped them define their goals, what they want to accomplish in life, why they're a family, what their family's all about, and then you help them refocus on those goals. Crisis managers, to which we will turn in the next 2 chapters, because you will have some rudimentary skill in crisis management, and you may decide to pursue that to a larger extent because we have so many crises in New Orleans, from shootings to hurricanes. You may decide to become a crisis manager, a formal crisis manager, which would be a good skill to have after you finish with your degree. Or, let me just plant the seed, degrees, because I would hope that you would pursue your master's and eventually a doctorate. However, let's not put the cart ahead of the horse. You need crisis management skills because you will be dealing with trauma and stress and crisis all the time as social workers. Okay, so crisis managers then help the family understand their goals. And then to realize what those goals are in the face of this disruption. Now, the one thing you don't want to do is impose your own goals on the family. You want to help them come up with their goals, right? We are not in the business of telling families what to do, but working with families as partners. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. So, as we consider using social supports to cope with the crisis, we also need to consider that outside resources can really be helpful. And so one of our roles may be to help them identify what resources are available to them. Some are already in their world: extended family, clubs, church, community center, whatever, right? And some of the supports may be things that they don't even realize exist, like bill payment programs or services that are available to clients such as they are. So the family then develops, because of these outside resources and social supports that kind of help them, gird them up during crisis, they develop a new, stable, predictable pattern. In other words, they've improved their functioning and thus are more resilient and resistant to future crises. Or they could go all the way back to their previous pattern of phase one, which may or may not work when the next crisis comes. All told, we're really trying to help them change. So let's move to the final slide of the family stress model, or family distress model. This new pattern involves second order change, which means they can't just change in little ways temporarily, but really have to bring about some structural changes to their family to move forward in the future. This change occurs because of a crisis. Something has to shift the family off their center. I mean, as long as the family's balanced and doing fine, they're not going to change. But when a crisis comes and shifts that homeostasis, then they have to respond in some way by reorganizing their family. Now, once they are reorganized and they've got some coping skills, then they can move back to phase one with this new normal or new predictable skills, predictable patterns of functioning, right? Okay, so that's kind of a overview of the family distress model. Pretty helpful when it comes to thinking about how social workers can respond to families in stress. Now we want to turn to the contextual model of family stress, which will be on the next slide. So the contextual model of family stress is essentially an adaptation of the ABCX model that we've studied ad infinitum. You know, we've gone over and over and over in this class, and by now it's been drilled into you. So they've taken some pieces and parts of the skeleton of the ABCX model and built in some new capacity, some new ideas. This is really useful to social workers who are working with distressed families, and we will find a lot of them. Another element of this is it tries to incorporate diverse backgrounds. Not all families are alike, right? So the techniques that we use maybe to help a family from the Garden District may be different than the techniques we use to help somebody from the 17th ward, right? Because they've got different ways of viewing the world. So those diverse backgrounds can be helpful as we consider how to intervene with families undergoing stress and crisis. So let's begin to look at some of these elements. We'll start here with the contexts. So let's move to the next slide. Now, see what the circle is there? There's a couple of contexts that we're going to consider when we think about working with these families. There's a set of external resources or external contexts that we might consider things like culture, history, economy, development, and heredity. And then there's some internal contextual issues, the way the family is structured, their psychological makeup, and their kind of philosophy about life. And those two may find themselves in conflict with each other. Let's explore these in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. So first, the external conflict. These are elements that the family has little control over and really not much they can do about these things. They still, however, influence the family and how they react to stressors. Cultural issues. The rules of our part of society, the rules of the larger society. What are the rules of American society? And then we also have to consider the rules of our subculture. So there's New Orleans as a whole, but there's also parts of New Orleans. Like if you go out to the far east of New Orleans, you'll see this part of town called Versailles, where all the billboard, the store signs are written in Vietnamese, and people speak Vietnamese. They also speak English. There's a Vietnamese church, Our Lady, I think, Queen of Vietnam. It has an annual Tet festival, or a New Year festival, Oriental New Year festival. And this part of town thinks very differently than, say, where I'm from, Hollygrove. Hollygrove, primarily black. We've got a set of rules for how we deal with each other on the street. We say hi when we walk by each other. There's kind of a different way of dressing and thinking and acting. And then you go across town, say, to the Garden District, where it's mostly, people with significant money, right? And they kind of think about the world differently than the rest of us. So that would be some cultural features. Historical. Who has our family been in the past, and how has that led to where we are now? So these are kind of the generational influences, things that we really can't control. And also, when we think of historical, we want to think of ourselves in the current historical moment. So the way that my parents responded to LGBTQIA issues, plus issues, are very different than the way my children do. Because the times have changed, right? So the current historical moment is also an impacting factor upon how families respond to stress. Economic. The family has a certain amount of money, and that influences what they can do in terms of responding to these just external factors. But also, society has ups and downs financially. And so you've got times like the Great Depression, where the whole economy collapsed and everybody was in some kind of financial crisis, versus just this family being in a financial crisis because the rest of society is doing okay. So we have ebbs and flows in our economic realities in America, right? And those, and in the globe, frankly, and those can impact families as well. Developmental. Where is the family in terms of their life stages? Remember those McGoldrick's life stages and the transitions that are taking place? Those are external factors that can't really be controlled. I mean, kids are going to grow up and people are going to get married, and those kind of external factors influence the family. And then finally, hereditary. These are genetic factors. We are who we are. Our genes are what they are. And until we find ways of altering the genomic patterns of individuals, we all have a heredity that's going to impact our world, and there's little we can do to control it. Now, let's move on to looking more at the internal context. The internal context are the things that families can change. The focus for us as social workers, because we have access to these and we can help the family do something with them. For example, the structure of the family. We can help a family function differently. We can help them draw healthier boundaries. We can help them better define their roles and even shift roles as necessary. We can help them define their rules, deciding what is necessary and what's not necessary. Here's an example of a written rule versus a non-written rule. A non-written rule says that a written rule may say that a kid needs to come home by, say, 10 o'clock. Now, that's the written rule. The non-written rule is this. If the child comes home at 10:05 and the parent does nothing, guess when the curfew is? 10:05. If they come home at 10:15 and the parent says nothing, guess when the curfew is? 10:15. If they come home at 10:30 and the family goes nuts, guess when the curfew is? 10:15, right? Because the family, if they don't respond to the rules in a way that enforces the rules, and the kids will stretch you. This is what kids do. It's part of growing up and becoming independent. They push the rules, they push the boundaries. And so we can help families organize their rules, right? Secondly, there's a psychological element to the internal context. How does the family perceive the stressor? How are they cognitively and emotionally addressing that stressor? We can help them cognitively redefine the stressor. So instead of, oh my God, this is a catastrophe, we can help them say, okay, let's break it down into pieces and deal with each of those pieces and then move forward. And then effectively, the emotional content, oh my God, we can't deal with this. You can help them kind of calm themselves, identify their emotions, and respond differently emotionally to the stressor. And then finally, philosophically, we've talked a lot in the past about the family worldview or the family schema, what gives the family a structure, a lens through which they view the world. Is it a Christian lens? Is it an Islamic lens? Is it a Judeo-Christian lens? Is it are they looking at the world through a lens of want and need instead of abundance and access? Are they seeing themselves as victims or conquerors? These are kind of philosophical things that we can help a family change. So in the next slide, then, we're going to move to the A, B, C, and X in this contextual model. So let's move on. Okay. I've circled, and it's a little bit more difficult to see my circles, but there's a larger circle around that kind of inner piece, right? The A, B, C, and X. And so we will deal with each of these one by one in the next few moments. But you don't really need to do much work on this because you've already been exposed to the ABCX model. So the A is the stressor or the event. What happened that kind of pushed this family to the point that they are? The B, as with the ABCX model, is their resources. But what do they have available to them? And this also could be seen as their strengths. Some strengths are internal to an individual. Some strengths are internal to the family. Some strengths are external, the supports they have around them. C is their perception of the event or the stressor. And then X is the degree of the stress, low to high. I mean, if it's just a little stressor, then it's really not going to throw the family off its balance too bad and throw them into crisis. But if it's a major stressor, that may throw them into crisis, right? And so in this model, it's a very simplistic model that kind of considers the context of stress. And it places the context of stress into either external, things that they can't control, or internal, things that they can control. And then gives that life by placing it around the ABCX model. So there you have it. You've got the contextual model of family stress as well as the family distress model. These two things can work hand in hand. The contextual model can give you an overall bird's eye view of what's happening to the family through the lens of these two contexts, external and internal, whereas the family distress model can help you understand the phases that the families go through to arrive at either healthy functioning or unhealthy functioning. Now, these two models are far simpler than some of the complex models that we've had in the past. And so they can be very helpful to you in thinking about how stress occurs, how stress affects the family, and what the families do. And this could really lead to some good interventions for you. In the next couple chapters, when we move to 10 and 11, we talk about formal crisis management, we'll move specifically into some of those interventions. And so get ready for that. Meanwhile, take the quiz on this lecture and then move item by item until you get to the discussion board. Respond to the discussion board by Wednesday and to the posts of at least 3 of your classmates by Saturday, and then move on to Module 10. Look forward to seeing you on the flip side. Bye, y'all.